This afternoon's study takes us to, well, a few places in the book of Exodus and then over to the book of Job. We're looking at a man named Bezalel, and then we'll look at a man named Bildad and a couple of other guys that go along with him. Bezalel, just to maybe refresh our memory or learn something new. He was the chief architect of the tabernacle who was given the assignment to design it and execute the building of it. Bezalel. His name means under God's shadow. He was a very skilled man, it seems. Spirit-filled workman. He was chosen by God to do this work because he had the skill in wood and what are the other ones it mentions? Metal, wood, and stone. So God chose him to do this great work. He had given this man the ability, the skill set to do that. And as such, he chose him to do the work. It was a very important work also. The tabernacle, as we know, was a very important part of God's covenant at that time. So it was a heavy responsibility. But we learn, among other things about him, what it says here in Exodus 36:2, also Exodus 31, I probably should have included in there also. It says, "See, I have called by name Bezalel, the son of Uri, son of Hur, of the tribe of Judah. I have filled him with the Spirit of God, with ability and intelligence, with knowledge and all craftsmanship, to devise artistic designs, to work in gold, silver, and bronze, cutting stones for for setting, and in carving wood to work in every craft." So God says, I have filled him with the Spirit of God, and I've also filled him with the ability and the intelligence and knowledge to do this work that I want him to do. And really, we can see this is how God works in general. God gives us all different abilities, and because of the abilities he gives us, he expects us to use those abilities for his service. Obviously, Bezalel would not be expected to do work of other sorts. He was expected to do the work based on the skill set that God had given him. And another passage, the one there on the screen, chapter 36, verse 1 says, "Bezalel and Aholiab and every craftsman in whom Jehovah has put skill and intelligence to know how to do any work in the construction of the sanctuary shall work in accordance with all that Jehovah has commanded. And Moses called Bezalel and Aholiab and every craftsman in whose mind Jehovah had put skill, everyone whose heart stirred him up to come to do the work." Really, that's about as much as we can say about the man himself. But we learned some pretty good lessons from that. One, I would say there is always a right man for the job. Put right man in quotation marks, obviously. There is a right person for the job. We kind of touched on that this morning in 1 Corinthians, where Paul said, if you pick two men that you feel are best suited for this work, pick them, and we'll send the money to Jerusalem through them. And if you want, I'll go with them. You see, pick the best men. We alluded to it in Acts 6. You choose men to take care of this work with the widows, distribution of the widows' support, and that's obviously the wisest way to do that. Pick the ones who would be the best at that work. It's not a slap in the face to anybody else. It's just they would be best for this work, and that requires us to know what we would be best at doing, and to utilize that. Dean? Exactly. And, it kind of makes, there I did, snapped it into, got to manhandle it. God, it says that God said, I have filled him with this, but that doesn't necessarily mean that God is saying, just recently I made this special endowment on him, like for however old he was. It's not that his whole life God hadn't filled him with that, but then now that the work is ready, he now like zapped it into him. It doesn't necessarily mean that, but it could just mean the same as with all of us. God, he has this ability, and God is saying, I've given him this ability that he has. And so God knew he would be the best one to do it. And that's a pattern for us. Who would be best to do a certain work? Yeah, that we don't want to get too off base here, but why did Jesus pick Judas to handle the money? I don't know. He had his reasons, and he knew what he was doing for whatever. Apparently, maybe he was the best to do that. Unfortunately, his heart wasn't exactly pure, and so he was also skimming some money out of the money box. But as far as he obviously cared about money, so Jesus knew he would. Yeah, the imperfection was mixed in there with what he was good at. Number 2, we should use our God-given skills to perform our God-given tasks with all our might. No haphazardly, just sort of, okay, this is good enough, this is good enough. Sometimes good enough is good enough. But when it comes to God's work, the cause of Christ, we ought to do it to the maximum that we're able, just like he did. Number 3, our work should be according to the Holy Spirit's direction. That passage I read a second ago, both of them really. They shall work in accordance with all that Jehovah has commanded. Yes, he was to use the skills that God gave him, but he was to use them within the bounds of his commands. Same is true for us. And I've heard it plenty of times. I have this ability, or I have that ability, and I just want to use it for God's glory, so I'm going to use it, acting or playing an instrument. Yes, we have talents, but it's not to God's glory if we're not doing it within the bounds of God's commands. Yes, sir. Yeah. Yeah. That's a very practical skill to have. The one, his line of work. He could have done all kinds of good things with that skill, build people houses and things. But what could be better than building the tabernacle of Jehovah? What could possibly be better than that? So same for us. We have skills that might help us in the workplace and at school, but how can we use those talents and skills, and not just talents, but also personality traits? How can we use them to be even more effective with the work of the cause of Christ and general good? That's one of the saddest things about the way influence works. The most influential people in the world are hardly ever, if ever, New Testament Christians who are using their influence to bring out good in people. It never works that way, it seems. Yeah. Or you can, for the time being, just work within the bounds of what you can do. That's why it's important, I think, to strategically choose the people that are on each shift at the fair, because some people may be better at the initial contact. Other people might be better at more of a supporting role, but they're both helpful. So find your thing and focus on that. Yeah. Yep. Yeah, and he helped make them better players, and they in turn were helping him be a better player. So that kind of dynamic just it takes a group from being a group of basketball players to being a team, and then that's one reason why they were so formidable in the 90s like that. And number 4, our hearts should be stirred up to come and to do the work. That's based on that passage there in Exodus 36, verse 2. Moses called them, those craftsmen, in whose mind Jehovah had put skill, and everyone whose heart stirred him up to come and to do the work. Sometimes that is the first step, and the thing that's lacking in many. I have the skill, but I don't have the stirring up. I don't have my heart is not stirred up to come and to do the work. All lessons we can learn from Bezalel, even though you may have never even heard that name until today. But you may have heard this name, Bildad. Whether you've heard the name or not, you know who he is. He's one of the men, one of Job's friends. One of Job's 3 friends that came to him. Interestingly, his name means son of contention, or perhaps Lord Adad, which we'll see in just a second. Actually, I'll just go ahead and tell you. Hadad means to shout. So, Lord of shouting, or Lord of, that's where contention comes in. But he was one of Job's 3 friends who visited him when he was in that time of great distress. What we learn about that, we've talked about it several times in the past. The thing that I find most moving in the whole situation is at the end of chapter 2, the section there that says Job's 3 friends. My Bible says anyway, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. It says when they saw him from a distance, they didn't recognize him. They raised their voices and wept, and they tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads toward heaven. Actually, verse 11, I meant to read the last part. They made an appointment together to come to show him sympathy and comfort him. They made an appointment together. They heard about their friend and all that had befallen him. All his kids died, were killed. He's got this, horrible disease, whatever it is, boils all over his body, and a wife that wasn't helping him too much. Why don't you just die? How encouraging for your loving wife to say. But they found out about it, and they made an appointment to go and visit him. And then verse 13 says, they sat with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his suffering was very great. Hold that thought, because it's only downhill from there, depending on how you look at it. Dean, do you have something? Yeah, it just shows how bad it was. Didn't even recognize their old friend. Their friend that, obviously they were close enough for them to have heard about him. It's not like they got on Facebook and saw, oh, wow, they're going through something. But it would be a lot more difficult to even hear about somebody in those conditions. But they got there, and sometimes it's so bad that there's just nothing you can say. And that's not a bad thing. In Job's case, what are you going to say to your friend who's just experienced all 10 of his kids being killed in a catastrophic event? What do you say to them? I know we had the best intentions, but sometimes whatever we say is still not very helpful. Yeah. Yeah. Another thing he was alone, though. Sort of exiled. So them being there, there's power in that. Yep.
Well, sometimes you experience some of the things, but you wouldn't experience all the things that he did. So you could experience some of the pain in that they go and play a lot of child, but with every one of them, that's something that, you're probably not going to experience. But that's the kids is something that, some of the things that we could experience have sympathy, but not all things.
Yeah. I think that sometimes made a distinction between sympathy and empathy. I'm not sure if there is so much of a distinction as much as we might say, but I think generally the way I remember being taught, or the way I think I was taught, I didn't pay very much attention to my own discredit, but sometimes empathy is more defined as something that you have been through. You can relate because you've been through it, whereas sympathy is more of the general, I haven't been through that, but I still know that it's awful. I know that it's awful for you. So yeah, they probably hadn't been through, obviously, what he had been through, but they know that it's awful. They can see it. And even before they saw it, they heard of it, and they just wanted to be there. And I think almost any person who's been through a severe spout of mourning and grieving, it's those people that they remember the most. The people that are just there. They don't necessarily have to talk to them. Maybe your mom comes over and stays with you for a few days or something, or some other, like a grandma or another family member, and they're just there at the house. Grandma may be, knitting over there in the chair. It's not like the whole time they're having a big talk, a big deep, let's get out of this talk, but just there, just doing her thing. There's comfort in that, just the presence of other people. They had done everything right up to this point. No one spoke a word, for they saw that his suffering was very great. The sad thing is, it didn't stop there. Because Job speaks and curses the day of his birth, but then the first friend that's named Eliphaz decided to speak up. And he gave a big speech. And that's what our book calls Bildad, the man who made a speech. Which may seem pretty vague, but he made a speech when there was really no need for him to make a speech. And that speech, let's see, I think Bildad specifically is in chapter 8 and then in chapter 18. But basically, all they were speaking up to say was, Job, you've sinned. This is your own fault. You've sinned, and you're denying it, and you're hiding it from God. You're trying to hide it from God. You're denying it, and therefore, God is doing this to you to snap you out of it. So just fess up. Yeah, that's what they believed. And the Jews believed that even in Jesus' day. That was a general idea. Just like we talked about recently with, in the parables, how wealth on earth must mean wealth in spirit, because God gave them that wealth, and He wouldn't have given them that wealth if they weren't right in heart. So the opposite is also true. If somebody's in Job's position, it has to be because they've done something to anger God and God's punishing them. The problem was that isn't true. It wasn't true in Job's case, and it isn't true in anybody's case as far as the way God deals with the sins of individuals. But anyway, Bildad speaks up and says, you need to repent. Just quit all this game. We're sorry for your pain, but you're not fooling anybody here. Just confess it and get this over with. Make this stop. But Job he simply was saying, I haven't done anything. Not that he's sinless, but saying, I haven't done anything for this to happen. They kept going and kept going. They were so convinced that what they believed about God was true that they persisted. Tried to reason with him, but they weren't listening. Maybe was their big problem. So they tried and tried and tried. The good news in the end is that God restored everything, but it also seems that after they were rebuked by God, they repented, it seems. So it says Eliphaz and Bildad and Zophar went and did what Jehovah had told them. And Jehovah accepted Job's prayer. So they did listen. They did finally admit that they were wrong and out of line for accusing their friend of this and accusing God of this even. And they made it right. Yeah, Dean? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Yeah, sin has consequences. Sometimes they're earthly, physical consequences, just like doing drugs. Will sometimes have, effects much later in your life. Sometimes there are consequences in a more immediate sense, like disease that you might carry, that you might contract from somebody else. But not all sins work like that. But that doesn't mean there aren't consequences. We can't forget about the spiritual and mental and emotional, psychological consequences of a life of sin.
It doesn't always mean like really rad. It doesn't mean that the rad
Yeah, as far as somebody committed a sin and God says, "Ha ha, I'm going to show you," that it doesn't exist. God has done that in very rare instances in the past, but that was to teach a lesson, like with Nadab and Abihu. God doesn't operate like that normally, but there were times in certain instances when God said, if you do this, this is going to happen, and He made it happen. But that was not the case in Job's situation, and it's not the case in anybody's situation at this point. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And there's some things that we don't really understand.
Yeah, and even how horrible of a situation that is, it is, like you said, it's an opportunity to really encourage other Christians and make an example of yourself, how you handle it. That's whenever you might be under the microscope even more, and it's just an additional sort of benefit, for lack of a better word. All right, here's what we can learn from Bildad. It is good to visit with friends in times of need or trouble. That is a good thing to do. It's good. And sometimes the best thing to say is nothing. Just like the old Alison Krauss song? I think it was her song. You say it best when you say nothing at all. You ever heard that song? It's true. Now, that's more of a love song, I think, but it's also true in this sense. The best thing they did for Job was just showed up and didn't before they started talking. Now, the Scriptures, it doesn't say that, but we know that Job would, if we could ask him, Job, what did you appreciate the most about your friends coming? There's no way that he would say anything but just when they were here and stayed with me for a whole week. 7 days, 7 nights. Or at least, if that's figurative, an extended period of time. Sometimes the best thing to say is nothing. You don't have to say something. That's the thing. We feel like we have to. If we go to a funeral or a visitation, we feel like we have to say something, and there's only a handful of things we usually say, and I'm not trying to make anybody feel bad for whatever you've said, but there are some kind of cringy, kind of cliche things like that maybe we just don't say anything. Like anything about some poetic thing about angels and, that, just maybe just say, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for your loss. Because sometimes there's just nothing to say. Yeah, Dean?
I've heard a story of the illustration about a person that was this church behind. So the preacher or the owner went over to visit him. They had a fire. And he took just one of the coals of the fire, laid it outside the fire, and it was in there. But when the individual got
Mm-hmm. No need. Yep. Thirdly, we must be careful in the acceptance of tradition handed down by men. Remember, they were so convinced that they were arguing with their friend. So it started with a friendly visit out of love and concern, turned into a debate because they were so convinced that what they believed, that they had always been told, was true. And they couldn't even open their minds enough to think, maybe that's not what's going on here. And I will put in the caveat that when the Scriptures speak, you don't have to question. You should be convinced. You should be just as convinced as these three men were about what the Bible actually says. But their problem was, it was nothing that the Bible actually said. It was just what they believed, what they thought, the way they thought God worked, the way they thought. And with us, any tradition that people have today, it seems like those are the things that people cling to the most. But we need to be careful with that. If we can't find it in the Bible, then we don't need to be dogmatic about it because, yeah, it may be true. I'm just speaking hypothetically. The thing that the Bible doesn't necessarily say may be true, but that's not to say that it should be, sternly, this is the way that it is, whenever we don't have any proof of that being the way that it is. So a lot of their problem was that they were reckless, I guess, with what they thought was right, the truth about their friend, so much that they thought they could read his mind and heart. Saul of Tarsus is another good example. He was convinced, but he was wrong, and he admitted it, that he was fully doing what he thought with a clean conscience, doing what God wanted him to do, but he realized he was not.